Welcome to the African Utility Studio. We have got Frank Spencer with us, and he is the Business Development for Renewables at Conco Energy Solutions. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio today.
It's only a pleasure, it's great to be here.
And how is the event going so far? It is the first day, but what is your first opinion of it?
Yeah, it's actually been very busy. So I've been at the stand most of this morning and thought I might have a little bit of time to wander around and see what's happening. But actually we've had a lot of traffic coming through and it seems pretty busy. And I guess it will get busier now as we head to lunch. So far it's been really great. Yeah,
fantastic.
Enjoying it.
Now your focus is on PV. Let's delve a little bit into that. Where do you see PV going in Africa at the moment? Is it on the right track?
So I think we're getting onto the right track. Obviously Africa is one of the best solar resources globally, and the prices of solar projects have plummeted in the last few years. So I think particularly in Africa you're starting to see the price of energy from solar being very competitive, if not more competitive than your alternative technologies, or at least the fossil fuels or even the nuclear technologies. And so the amount of interest, particularly in solar and PV projects in Africa, is certainly growing massively at the moment. And with South Africa actually having proven to date it can be done, I think we're going to see a lot of follow-on from the rest of Africa in the next few years.
Fantastic. What are your the most interesting markets for you at the moment as a company?
So for us as a company, obviously South Africa is perhaps our home market, but we are represented already in 18 countries across Africa. At the moment, the markets from a solar perspective that we're very active in, firstly, is Namibia. Namibia has a very good program at the moment for 5 megawatt class PV projects, and a number of those are coming to financial close at the moment. There's also a lot of activity in the likes of Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania. So we're starting to look at projects in those markets as well. But certainly I think there almost isn't a country in Africa that's not looking at or already executing solar projects at some scale.
So I mean that is very interesting for me. You know, the continent has a rich abundance of natural resources, specifically solar. So why are we still sitting with energy poverty in large parts of Africa?
So I think a lot of that has to do with perhaps the difficulty of getting investment done in these projects. These projects are costly, they are long-term projects. Getting them banked in countries where perhaps the political and economic stability is not great. So we are seeing, I think, in countries where that isn't such a big issue, that things are starting to happen. And I think, again, that will probably, as the case studies get proven in various markets, the market will grow. Yeah. But I think a lot of it has to do with the regulatory environment as well, being suitable for privately owned energy projects. And that is a relatively new thing, I think, well, certainly to South Africa and also in Africa.
Right. And is South Africa still leading the way as far as renewables, as far as the renewables development program is concerned?
I think certainly to date that's been the case. The REIPP program has been immensely successful and brought online perhaps some of the most competitive renewables projects in the world, even competing with some of the other key markets. Yeah. And I think that's really shown what can be done with renewables. So I think other markets will follow.
Great.
In adopting similar programs. I think perhaps where we'll see one of the major differences in Africa compared to South Africa is that South Africa obviously has an existing and very good transmission and distribution network from the grid perspective that doesn't necessarily exist in many other countries that have quite a diverse population. Right. And I think this is particularly where solar will play a huge role, is in distributed generation, microgrid types of technologies. And I think almost like how we've seen cell phones leapfrog fixed line, I think we're moving into an era where we'll see similar happening with distributed generation, that it will actually leapfrog building large grids to take electricity from large central plants to lots of small plants where they're actually needed.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, I remember last year I was interviewing Eskom and they were saying that they were having difficulty in linking up a lot of the new resources, new wind developments to the existing transmission link. So it would really make sense that these microgrids are almost planned first and then linked up you know, to the central line at a later stage? Is that where you think
Completely
it's all
possible,
going?
yeah.
Right.
And I think what will be the game changer, and there's a lot of talk around storage technologies, and as those prices come down, that's what will drive the adoption of microgrids. When we're not far off from complete solar battery systems that are completely off grid, actually competing with grid prices. And even in South Africa, that can be considered a threat to municipalities who have some of the higher tariffs. That we're not far away from people being able to build a solar battery system, provide all their electricity, and not need to take from the grid, because they can do it themselves at competitive prices.
Right.
And that will also, I don't think, be any different in the rest of Africa, particularly in markets that have high electricity prices because they're running from diesel or other thermal plant.
Absolutely. The idea is just to get that perfect mix where you're not spending all your money on diesel, specifically because of the unreliability of power in most places. They rely on fossil fuels generally, especially, you know, big mining, you know, factories, mining, industrial. They really do rely on you know, a steady source of power. Do you think that would be possible with solar eventually in time to come?
I think so. I think it's coming. I think we're very close to the days of where solar battery systems can compete with diesel.
Right.
And it won't be long before that will be the case. And then we'll start to see, I think what we'll see is a bigger mix of technology. So exactly like you said, there's a lot of mining entities that run purely on diesel because there's no grid available.
Right.
Or a lot of entities, even in countries with grid infrastructure, but that's poorly available.
Yeah.
There's a lot of backup diesel infrastructure.
Absolutely.
You'll start seeing this hybridized more and more with solar and or solar battery systems to create more flexibility and lower cost ultimately.
Great. If you could give advice to utilities or even to you know, sort of industries that would like to, you know, create their own generation from solar, what would that advice be?
Come speak to us. No, but,
Fair enough.
I think for utilities, I think the biggest, or one of the biggest issues is still caught in a traditional way of thinking, that the way utilities build and operate grids follows a particular methodology, and certainly that's still the case in South Africa, where globally that methodology is changing, and it's the shift from having, again, big central power plants and long distribution networks, and again the paradigm of baseload and peaking plant. Whereas I think what we're seeing, and certainly it's happening internationally, and perhaps the utilities in Africa still have some catch up to do, is looking at more distributed types of technologies, more flexibility in the grid, not focusing so much on baseload, but looking at the ability to deliver the capacity and the energy that's required. And it's a different way of designing grids or designing energy systems and I think, you know, they run the risk of almost becoming obsolete as utilities if the private sector just start adopting newer technologies by themselves. And for the private sector, I think it's certainly a good time to be looking at what's coming. Because maybe today isn't the day that you're going to build a solar plant, but it's highly probable that within the next few years, many private industries will, because the economics make sense. And we're seeing that already in South Africa, a huge adoption by the private sector where they can of solar PV, because it makes economic sense. And we would have a significantly bigger private market if the regulatory barriers weren't so difficult in South Africa for the private sector, for private PV. Whereas perhaps those barriers don't exist in other markets. And I'll talk for Namibia. You go to Namibia, you'll see solar everywhere, because they actually encourage it and it makes sense, and they're getting the private sector to build power plants. So it's quite exciting.
Right. Okay, well, I mean, Africa is quite a large space and covers many countries, and I'm guessing that the more they all communicate with each other, especially when they have successes in this particular field, that can only help the whole situation.
Absolutely, and that's why it's great to have conferences like this one, where you've got people coming from utilities and other private markets across Africa to exchange knowledge and learn and see how, perhaps see how things can be done with renewables. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. It's only the first day, so I'm sure you've got an action-packed couple of days. But thank you so much again for joining us.
Only a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I am Denise from Ngerati.